Robert had been my mentor for 5 years. His announcement at my book launch revealed a literary scandal that would destroy my career before it even started. I still remember the weight of my first published novel in my hands that evening. The bookstore was packed with people I'd never seen before, literary agents with their practiced smiles, local book club members clutching their wine glasses, and a handful of friends who'd shown up out of loyalty rather than genuine interest in literature. The fairy lights strung across the ceiling cast everything in a warm glow, and I felt like I was living in a dream I'd been chasing since college. Robert stood near the back of the room, watching me with this strange expression I couldn't quite read. He'd been more than just my publisher over the past 5 years. When I was waiting tables and writing in coffee shops until they kicked me out, he was the one who saw something in my scattered short stories. He helped me find my voice, taught me about pacing and character development, and somehow convinced me that my grandmother's old bedtime stories could become something real and published. The evening started perfectly. I read from chapter 3, the part where my protagonist discovers the hidden room in her inherited house, and people actually laughed at the right moments. Someone asked about my writing process, and I gave what I thought was a charming answer about finding inspiration in family stories. The bookstore owner mentioned that pre-orders were already coming in from other locations. I was floating. Then Robert walked to the front of the room and asked for the microphone. The moment he started speaking, something cold settled in my stomach. His voice carried that formal tone he used during serious business meetings, not the warm mentorship voice I was used to. He talked about literary integrity and the responsibility publishers have to their readers. People stopped their side conversations and turned to listen, sensing something important was about to happen. That's when he dropped the bomb that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. He announced that my entire book was plagiarized from an obscure manuscript from the 1960s that he had discovered in his archives. Not inspired by, not similar to, but completely stolen from. He said he had concrete evidence that I had lifted the plot structure, the character names, even entire passages word for word. The audience went silent in that terrible way that makes your ears ring. I watched faces change from polite interest to shock to something that looked like disgust. The wine glass in my hand started shaking so badly I had to put it down. Literary agents were already pulling out their phones, probably texting their assistants to make sure my name never crossed their desks again. The book club ladies were whispering behind their hands, and I could practically see the local newspaper headline writing itself in real time. Robert kept talking, methodically laying out the case against me like a prosecutor. He mentioned specific page numbers, quoted passages that supposedly matched the original manuscript, and explained how he'd traced the connections through his extensive archives. With each detail, I felt my future crumbling. The teaching positions I'd applied for, the writing workshops that had accepted me, the small literary magazine that had agreed to publish my next short story. All of it would disappear once word got out. But here's what made it worse than just professional humiliation. I genuinely had no memory of ever seeing this 1960s manuscript he was talking about. I wasn't some scheming plagiarist who thought she could get away with theft. I was just confused and terrified, standing there in my new dress that I'd bought specifically for this night, trying to understand how my life had just been destroyed by someone I trusted completely. The bookstore felt like it was shrinking around me. People were already starting to leave, and the ones who stayed were clearly just waiting for the drama to unfold completely. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that there had to be some mistake, but what could I possibly say that wouldn't sound like desperate lies? Date 1. The immediate aftermath was worse than I could have imagined. By the next morning, literary blogs were already picking up the story. Someone had recorded Robert's announcement on their phone, and it was making rounds on social media with hashtags about publishing scandals. My email inbox was flooded with messages from people I barely knew, some offering support but most just wanting gossip details. I didn't leave my apartment for 3 days. My phone kept ringing with calls from journalists wanting statements, and I finally just turned it off. The book launch that was supposed to be the beginning of my career had become its ending before it ever really started. But the strangest part was Robert himself. After that night, he completely disappeared from my life. No phone calls, no emails, no explanations. His office assistant told me he was traveling and unavailable, which felt like the cruelest joke possible. The man who had mentored me through every step of becoming a writer had just publicly destroyed me and then vanished. I spent those first few days obsessing over every bedtime story my grandmother had ever told me, trying to remember if she'd ever mentioned reading them somewhere else. She passed away when I was 12, and her stories had always felt like pure magic to me. The way she described the hidden room, the mysterious letters, the family secrets buried in old houses, it had all seemed to come straight from her imagination. My parents were beside themselves. They kept calling to check on me, offering to fly out and stay for a while, but I couldn't handle having them see me like this. My dad kept saying there had to be some legal recourse, some way to prove my innocence. But how do you prove you didn't plagiarize something when apparently all the evidence suggests you did? The worst part was the doubt that started creeping in. What if I had somehow absorbed these stories from somewhere else and genuinely forgotten? What if my grandmother had been retelling someone else's work all along, and I'd unknowingly built my entire literary identity on borrowed foundations? I started going through every box of my grandmother's things that my family had kept. Old photo albums, recipe cards, her collection of paperback mysteries. I was looking for anything that might explain the connection Robert had discovered, any clue that might help me understand what had happened. That's when I found the manila folder tucked behind her jewelry box. Inside were dozens of typed pages, yellowed with age, held together with a rubber band that crumbled when I touched it. The title page read, "The House of Forgotten Letters," with my grandmother's maiden name typed underneath. The date stamp in the corner showed 1963. My hands were shaking as I read the first page, then the second, then the third. It was my book. Not similar to my book, not inspired by my book, but literally my book. Every plot point, every character description, every carefully crafted scene that I thought I'd created from childhood memories. But here's what made my head spin. This wasn't some published manuscript that my grandmother had somehow obtained. The pages had notes in her handwriting scattered throughout the margins. Crossed-out sentences with better alternatives written above them. Character development ideas scribbled in the corners. This wasn't a copy of someone else's work. This was her original manuscript. Update 2. The revelation that my grandmother had been a secret novelist changed everything, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of feeling relieved, I felt completely lost. Who was I as a writer if everything I thought was my own creativity had actually come from someone else's imagination? I called Robert's office 17 times before his assistant finally admitted he was back in town. When I showed up at his building unannounced, clutching my grandmother's manuscript, he looked like he'd been expecting me. We sat in his office surrounded by towers of books and manuscripts, and he told me the whole story. He'd been going through estate papers that families sometimes donated to his literary foundation, and he'd found my grandmother's work mixed in with my family's donation after she passed. He'd recognized the stories immediately when I started telling him about my novel ideas during our mentorship sessions. But here's the twist that I never saw coming. Robert hadn't discovered the plagiarism by accident. He'd known from the very beginning that I was unknowingly recreating my grandmother's work. He'd watched me struggle through draft after draft, trying to capture something that felt just out of reach, never knowing I was chasing stories that had already been perfectly crafted decades earlier. He'd planned the entire book launch confrontation. His reasoning was complex and honestly kind of twisted. He believed that my grandmother's work deserved to be published, but he also felt that I needed to understand the weight of literary legacy. He wanted me to experience the shame and fear of being accused of plagiarism so that I would appreciate the responsibility of carrying on her stories. The worst part was realizing that everyone at that launch party had been in on it except me. The literary agents, the book club members, even the bookstore owner. Robert had orchestrated the entire evening as some kind of elaborate lesson about authorship and family heritage. I was furious in a way that went beyond anything I'd ever felt before. This man had put me through days of public humiliation and professional suicide for what he considered a learning experience. He'd watched me question my own sanity and integrity while knowing exactly what was happening. But then he showed me the letters. Hidden in my grandmother's manuscript were dozens of rejection letters from publishers throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Beautiful, Heartbreaking letters that praised her writing but explained that the market wasn't ready for her kind of story. Women's perspectives weren't considered commercially viable back then, especially not stories about family secrets and inherited mysteries. She died with this incredible work unpublished, never knowing that her bedtime stories to her granddaughter would someday find their way into the world through me. Robert had made copies of everything. He showed me my grandmother's detailed character notes, her plot outlines, even her research into the historical elements that appeared in both her manuscript and my novel. She'd been a serious, dedicated writer who'd been shut out of the publishing world because of her gender and the era she lived in. Reading her notes felt like having a conversation with someone I thought I'd known completely but had never really understood. She'd hidden this entire part of herself from our family, probably because the constant rejections had been too painful to share. The strangest realization was that I hadn't just inherited her stories through childhood memories. I'd inherited her actual writing style, her way of building tension, her specific approach to character development. Things I thought were my own natural talents were actually genetic gifts that had been passed down along with her secret manuscripts. Final update: the resolution to this whole mess came in a way I never could have predicted. After several long conversations with Robert and countless hours reading through my grandmother's complete works, she'd written 4 full novels, all unpublished. We came up with a plan that honored both her legacy and my own aspirations. We decided to publish her original manuscript alongside my version, creating a unique literary project that explored how stories travel through families across generations. The book became The House of Forgotten Letters, a grandmother-granddaughter legacy, with both our names on the cover. But the real magic happened when we started promoting it together, even though she was no longer alive to participate. I found myself telling audiences about the woman I'd thought I knew completely but had only understood partially. Her struggles as a female writer in the 1960s, her persistence despite constant rejection, her decision to channel her storytelling into bedtime stories for her granddaughter rather than abandoning it entirely. The literary community's response was incredible. Instead of the plagiarism scandal Robert had initially orchestrated, we ended up with something much more powerful. A conversation about how creativity moves through families, how stories survive even when they're not immediately published, and how women's voices from previous generations can find new life through their descendants. The book did better than any of us expected. Literary magazines wrote articles about inherited creativity and the oral tradition of storytelling within families. Book clubs loved the dual narrative structure, and several universities started using it in courses about family histories and women's literature. But the most meaningful response came from other women who reached out to share their own discoveries of hidden creative work by female relatives. Painters whose grandmothers had secret sketchbooks, musicians whose great-aunts had composed songs that never got recorded, writers whose mothers had filled journals with stories that no one knew existed. I learned that my situation wasn't unique. Throughout history, women had been creating art and literature that they kept private, either because they didn't believe it was good enough or because they knew the world wasn't ready to receive it. These hidden creative legacies were everywhere, waiting to be discovered by family members who thought they were the first in their lineage to pursue artistic careers. My relationship with Robert eventually healed, though it took months of difficult conversations. I came to understand that his methods had been questionable, but his intentions had been rooted in respect for my grandmother's work and a desire to see it finally reach readers. He'd witnessed too many talented writers die with their work unpublished, and he hadn't wanted that to happen to her legacy. The success of our joint publication opened doors I'd never expected. Publishers started reaching out about my own original work, separate from my grandmother's influence. I discovered that having her stories as a foundation had actually made me a stronger writer, not a weaker one. Understanding her techniques and approaches gave me tools to develop my own voice more effectively. 6 months after that disastrous book launch, I was signing copies of our collaborative work at the same bookstore where my career had supposedly ended. Some of the same people were there, including the book club ladies who now treated me like a literary celebrity rather than a suspected plagiarist. The experience taught me that creative legacy is more complicated than simply writing original work. Sometimes honoring the artists who came before us means acknowledging how their voices live on through us, even when we don't realize it's happening. My grandmother's stories had shaped me long before I ever sat down to write my first novel, and recognizing that connection made both her work and mine more meaningful. I still write in coffee shops until they kick me out, but now I carry copies of my grandmother's original manuscripts with me. Sometimes I'll read her margin notes and feel like she's sitting across from me, offering guidance about character development or plot structure. Her voice lives on not just through the stories she told me as a child, but through the professional writing advice she left scattered throughout her unpublished work. The hidden room in my novel, the mysterious letters, the family secrets buried in old houses. They all came from her imagination first. But the way I brought them to life, the emotional depth I gave to her characters, the contemporary relevance I found in her themes, that was my contribution to our shared creative legacy. In the end, the scandal that was supposed to destroy my career before it started actually launched it in a way I never could have planned. My grandmother's stories finally found their audience 40 years after she wrote them, and I learned that being part of a creative lineage is more powerful than trying to create something entirely from scratch. The book launch that began with public humiliation ended up being the foundation for everything good that followed. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to possibilities we never would have discovered otherwise.